This is episode 3 of the Venus Rising podcast, where we seek to personalize the profound by exploring the esoteric, the philosophic, the artistic, and the whimsical. Because without the whimsical, it would all be predictable. Today, we have the illustrious pleasure of being joined with author, spiritual cartographer, and living mystic, David Chaim Smith. David, cheers, buddy.
Thank you.
How are you today?
Good.
Chaim.
Very, very good. Happy to speak with you.
You too. Quite a
I just
pleasure.
hit the continue button, so
Oh, okay.
had a little pop-up. Bear
Let's see
with
here.
me.
The continue button. Oh, there's so many buttons. So how is life treating you today on this lovely Wednesday, David?
Well, about the same. My days don't vary a whole hell of a lot. I do basically my thing and not a whole lot else. Happy to talk about it.
So quick background for any of the viewers that might not be familiar with you. Most, I'm sure, who see this will be quite familiar with your work. You have been authoring books, my goodness, for almost, I want to say almost a decade now. You crank them out pretty consistently, and they're all reflections of your Qabbalistic sort of meditative journeys of interfacing with meditative states behind the veil of reality. And you're kind of mapping out, using Kabbalistic language and symbolism, you're mapping out alchemical processes behind the surface of the spiritual dimensions of reality. Would that be a loose estimation?
Well, the different books function in different ways, and some of them are books about something, meaning a topic-oriented book. For example, my first book was a commentary on the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and that's pretty specific. So that just reads kind of like a straight commentary. The next 2 books that I'm coming out with, that I'm awaiting delivery of now, offer kind of a cross-section of everything that I do, including one book that functions like my first book. It's a commentary on a Kabbalistic text from the 13th century called Fountain of Wisdom, which is extremely obscure and almost untouched by both the Jewish and the Hermetic sides of the study. And this particular commentary, like my Kabbalistic Mirror of Genesis commentary, just goes line by line and gives you what I have, and it doesn't pretend to be definitive. It doesn't pretend to be scholarly or historical in the sense that I'm not really commenting on a tradition in terms of other people's use of the material. I can only comment on what it is that I've done and what I do. So that's one style of book that I put out. Another style of book I put out is based on aesthetic sensations. The aesthetic feeling tones or resonances, the subtle qualities that arise from practice that can be put in forms of words and images in, like you said, a kind of a cartographic array, mapping out territories, usually using geometric patterning as a way to show relationships between parts. But that can take a couple of forms as well. For example, there might be a consideration of methodology or practice. There might be a concern for text with quotes and whatnot, where that breaks down into patterns that can be explored. Or there could be just a straight exposition of methodology, where I talk about specific practices and how they're done. And I do that a lot in relation to the tradition of contemplation. So you could say that the overarching theme behind all of this might have something to do with that. When I use the word contemplation, I'm not talking about it in the vernacular sense, which would be an intellectual pursuit like thinking deeply, which is something that most people, certainly that would be listening to this podcast, would feel that they're doing anyway and doesn't require any special effort. But the way that I'm using the term is related to the Hebrew word iyun, which is a very specific type of contemplation. It's contemplation in the mystical context, which means that there is an end game. It's not free form, right? The end game is the dissolution, the dissolving of self-identification and the dissolving of identity and identification as such, meaning the dissolution of solid mental constructs as a way to designate things, right? In other words, the mind's labeling process that through semiotics and linguistics posit meaning on bits of phenomena. Generally, what the mystic does is try to let the sum total of all of that construct making settle into what we call the ground of phenomena, which can be likened to space itself, the open fundamental essence of whatever arises, whether it be thoughts or feelings or sense perceptions or what we call physical objects or time or space or dimensions or even the realm of ideas. Whatever it is that arises, it all shares a common ground. And this ground, if you hold the view that I do, is the divine. And that's the point of the whole thing. So when I use the term contemplation, to me, it's synonymous with settling into the divine as part of a general desire to bind with the divine or be concerned with the divine, allowing every obstruction and obscuration to it a chance to dissolve and settle, So to me, the word contemplation is like synonymous with the word immersion, right? Immersion into the infinite, which the infinite, the word that most people would know that is used for the infinite is en sof, en without or no, sof meaning end or limit, without limit, meaning openness that is full, right? Open fullness. That's the point of the whole thing. So anything I could tell you goes back to that. Any book I've ever written, any drawing I've ever done is just about that. It's not about an audience or giving people something. It's not about me and whether I like it or not, right? It's divine service. That's the point. Divine service is the point.
Yeah, and I really feel that approach of yours, when I refer to anyone as a true living mystic, that's not a term I toss about lightly. Pretty much everyone in the esoteric or occult, genre of writing and, working and things like this, technically we're all mystically minded people. Very few of us are true living mystics, perhaps like in the Sufi old school Kabbalistic sense, where instead of simply working with the ideas, contemplating the ideas, as you mentioned, cognitively, maybe cross comparing them, taking an ontological approach to it. All of your work really carries through a person who has poured themselves into, I guess interfacing is the best word. When I first saw your artwork, I was blown away. I instantly thought, this man is like the H.R. Geiger of Qabalah. It's a very surface observation. But when I started reading some of your works and looking at more of your drawings, I can tell that behind these books, behind these images, is a man who is literally interacting with invisible worlds. And I gotta ask. I've been curious about this. I am assuming that most of the images that you draw, you're either receiving directly or you're translating into a visual format to communicate to people. But I would also assume there's probably a feedback loop going on once the images are created. Do you ever find yourself making images, depicting a concept, giving form to an activity, and then afterward learning from the image? Is it teaching you as well?
Oh, yeah. That's a very, very good insight and a really good question. It I do a variety of different things. It's not just one thing. And there's a spectrum of possibilities. And different pieces have to be taken in different contexts. None of them are really what I would call illustrations, which means that an illustration I'm defining as a prior set of data, like a conceptual idea or framework that you then portray or illustrate in some way. So you're servicing a pre-existing idea. I do that sometimes for books, but usually in the margins of books when I have to show a chart or a symbolic version of a graph or something like that, where there's really no room for any kind of invention or surprises. And I just have to strip it down. And usually it's just line ink work. And it's a one shot. And those are not my most interesting images. They're functional, right? So it's not illustration, which is usually what people think. Generally, what I do is I work blind, which means that I go into a drawing to excavate or explore and pull out material that is unknown to me, meaning, like you said, that I figure it out either in the process of excavating it or later after the piece is done. And generally, I find that since if your whole life has a single trajectory, right, and you're living for that trajectory, it's going to come out when you dive into the darkness and pull out whatever you pull out. So whatever you are, whatever you're not, it's going to be evident there, right? So the point of making my imagery do what I want is living that way, which is not to say that it's always successful or that even living that way is successful. I do the best that I can, and you get what you get. So my work is just a reflection of my practice. It's a sort of a synopsis of my practice. And it's funny that I don't intend on graphically representing states that have come about through, for example, contemplative practice, but they come out anyway. That's the weird thing about it, because whatever's in there is what you're going to pull out. So I don't try to do it. I don't know how it happens. It just happens, or it doesn't happen, right? And it's funny, I'm not a big David Lynch fan, but David Lynch, the director, filmmaker, made a really good point in an interview once. He said, if you're a creative person, you get a setup and then you wait. You're patient. And that's what it is, right? Meaning, like, I have a setup of my materials, pieces of paper, my pencils are in my pockets, so I don't need to, special materials. They're right here. And I have a chair and I sit. And if I think that I have to go to work, then that's all wrong. It either happens or it doesn't. You put me in a room long enough staring at a piece of paper, I'm going to get an image. Right. And
I remember in one of your very first interviews you did, you were sitting on a couch and you're surrounded by drawings all over the wall, true genius madman style. And at one point in the interview, you said, to be honest, most of my work is staring at a wall.
Yeah. Okay.
And it was funny, but it was true.
The video that you're talking about was done in a very specific place and time that was not explained in the video. it was in my teacher's office in a hermitage where I spend a good deal of my time. And I was tasked with filling my teacher's office. He took everything out of the office, painted all the walls white, and he wanted me to fill it floor to ceiling with what he asked for was to represent everything that I know. Because there were
There's
quite a
tall
few
order.
walls. Yeah. Draw and write everything that you know. And I had 2 weeks to do it.
So you were literally tasked by
Well,
your teacher.
I barely
to
left the room.
show what you know. Just
Yeah.
wow.
That video was me in there for 2 weeks, in that room for 2 weeks.
Huh.
Yeah. And then he came in and started drawing on the walls and whatnot. And in that video, there's him drawing on the walls and dancing around. And so that was done at the Hermitage in, I think, 2014 or 2013. About 7 years ago.
So there is a topic I really want to come back to, is the Hermitage. I know that there is some secrecy regarding your oral tradition, but let's talk quickly about your 2 books that you have coming out, and then I would love to come back to the Hermitage if you'd be willing to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, ask me anything you want.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you very much for sending over the copies of your 2 new books. And I noticed the wide array that you mentioned earlier with your work, that your work is multifaceted. The 2 books you are just coming out with now that just been released are The Quintessence of Secret Mercury and your commentaries on the Fountain of Wisdom. And the Fountain of Wisdom, as you mentioned, it's a very enigmatic text from the 1300s. Many people aren't aware of it. Without your commentary, it would have been a true enigma, almost like the Voynich text or something. It's non-linear, doesn't follow a certain progression. Your commentary in that was brilliant, and you added your own illustrations, and I could tell that that text right there, the Fountain of Wisdom, is one that is probably very personal and private to you. On your other book you've recently come out with, The Quintessence of Secret Mercury, totally different. It's not a commentary on an old text. It's your own Kabbalistic insights and writings. At one point, you get into the nitty-gritty of the actual mental construction of a Hebrew golem. Yeah. I found that fascinating. In that part of the book, I had to stop and sort of backtrack and reread certain sentences like 5 times just to make sure, did I read that correctly? Brilliant.
Well, the golem is basically a thought form. Most people take it as a physical being, but the whole point to contemplative mysticism is we don't believe there is such a thing as physical substance. That's why we don't hold a view that separates spirit and matter, because matter's already spirit. So what's the problem? But the whole thing about a golem is you're creating a visionary version of a creature, we could say, a living thing, a being, as a resonant echo or reflection of parts of yourself for various reasons. And in the case of the section of the book that you're talking about, it's about creating golems for sacrifice, the way that animals were brought to the fires of the temple and laid on the fire of the temple is what we call an olah, or all burned offering, in which case in temple times, the little critter, the bird or goat or whatever it was, would burn all the way through, and the smoke that would arise from the carcass of the animal would be suffused with the intentionality of the prayers of the Levites, of the priest, and would disperse in the sky. And the link of prayer, from the point of view of the temple, was the dissolving of the intentionality in the life force of the animal, suffused within the smoke, replete within the smoke, dissolving into the sky, right? When the temple was destroyed, this was done with letters and prayers, and that's the beginning of rabbinic Judaism, right? We're talking pre-rabbinic and then rabbinic points of view. But with a golem, what you're doing is neither of those two things, but in a sense, a little of both, right? You're creating a means to purify distorted parts of your own being by looking at them and imbuing them with life. And when I say life, I mean totalistically. There are internal organs, there's a structure, there's an anthropomorphic array. It sees and hears and feels and tastes and thinks, right? A golem does everything that you do because it is you, because there is no you, right? So if there is no you, then there could be infinite echoes of this phenomena we call consciousness. And if the goal is to realize the lack of self-identification of mind, and there is mind, then mind can do anything, including split off into myriad forms, and those forms can become sacrifices. We can burn them. We could smolder them on the flames of our own practice. So the smoke of their dissolving bodies would carry the intentionality of your work in ways that you yourself, as yourself, could not do, right? So the golem accomplishes what we as self-identified beings can't accomplish. And a great deal of literature surrounds the golem Sefer Yetzirah relationships supposedly involved. I never really understood exactly how the Sefer Yetzirah was used in the making of a golem. It's not very clear in Aryeh Kaplan's commentary, but it seems to me that in popular culture, a lot of the myths that became the popular conception of, for example, monster movies come from the golem. I think it was one influence in Mary Shelley's conception of Frankenstein was a golem. But even though a golem is not made from parts of dead people, was like a mud creature in the folklore. But it exists in Eastern European Jewish folklore. But there's a real Kabbalistic base of it, but nothing is written on it. Almost nothing.
Yeah, that concept of serving the function as a self-sacrificial reflection of perhaps qualities of yourself or a reflection of yourself. That's probably a usage of a golem many people haven't heard of before.
Right.
So that could be used in the spiritual practice literally to, when people talk about burning off dead wood or parting with the past or whatever, psychically and intentionally, literally casting those things onto a sort of scapegoat, so to speak, and killing it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also something that I've done every day for years. As you know, the things that I write about are things from my own practice.
And let's talk a little bit about The Fountain of Wisdom. So when did you discover that book? How did you come across that?
I lived at the Hermitage in the 90s, and mid to late 90s, I left the Hermitage and I was tasked with going back to Brooklyn, where I was from, to learn Qabalah in an expanded register. My background is Hermetic Qabalah, right? My background is not Jewish. I'm ethnically Jewish, but I don't have a Jewish background. So all I knew was the sort of post-Renaissance Hermetic version of Qabalah that comes out of Rosenroth and Kircher and Pico de Mirandola and all that. So I was tasked with going back and finding Jewish sources that went beyond that. So what I did was I started studying with a Hasidic lineage in, I think it was 98, 97, 98. And at the same time was part of a non-Hasidic Jewish lineage of what they call Miznagdim, or the other side of the coin, meaning the line that comes out of the Vilna Gaon, right? The Vilna Gaon, and then you get the approach of the Baal Shem Tov, are really quite different from each other, but in a sense really complement each other. So the Hasidic teacher was teaching me more devotionally oriented methodologies and use of what they call kavanas and yehudim, the technical Kabbalistic practices. And what the yeshiva guy, or the other side, Lithuanian side, was teaching me was basically kind of an overview of everything that you see in Aryeh Kaplan's Meditation and Qabalah, which is like a little bit of all the traditions. But he had his specialty, which was mostly Lurianic. So we're sitting there studying our Lurianic stuff, and this was Rabbi Alan Brill, by the way, was his name. And I studied with him one-on-one in his home for a couple of years. So we're sitting there doing our good Lurianic stuff, which is a known entity, and it's got a proper methodology. If you want to study the Lurianic Sforum, it's pretty clear how to do it. That's what everybody does. This is an official way to do it. So while we're digesting all this material, we're looking at some of the early pre-Lurianic stuff. And we're going through various 13th century things that this rabbi did not know a lot about, like Apolafia, and then this Iyun material from the 13th century. And then we came upon this text, Fountain of Wisdom, which is about 800 years old, that is unusual in the sense that, unlike most Kabbalistic text, it doesn't mention the Sfirot, right? It doesn't mention the worlds. It doesn't mention parts of the soul. It doesn't mention any of the stuff that people are familiar with. So like you said, how do you get your bearings, right? It's like a cascade of sensations that are not really contextualized or described, where you don't get any kind of framework to place it. Like the tree of life and the Sfirot and the worlds, that's a framework. That allows you to know that whatever little metaphor they throw in there, you can put it exactly where you need it, see what comes before it, what comes after it, strategize, and then you have a map, right? Qabalah is almost always extremely dependent upon a map. But this text is one of the only Kabbalistic texts that doesn't have that. So this rabbi I was studying with, we read through it, and he spoke a little bit about how he thought it related to his material. He was an expert in the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. And I kept making these comments about it because of my tantric background, my background of a sort of tantric alchemy that he was interested in but knew nothing about. But he saw that it related to this text. So he said to me, you know, you should really sleep with this text under your pillow, and hoping that it would start speaking to me. It's like somebody, maybe you, who knows, has to approach this from out of the loop. And when he said out of the loop, it was like out of the loop of the Jewish world. But what I came to find out later is that outside of the Jewish world, there is no interest in this text from, for example, Hermetic occultism. There is no interest in this text, at least in a written sense that I could ever find, from rogue schools at all. No alchemical tie-in, although it purports to have certain aspects of an alchemical text in it. It's sort of almost an alchemical text, you could say. So no rogue influences, no official influences, no devotional influences. Who used it? What's it for? Then I come to find out that there was this specific approach to contemplation in the 13th century, very, very specific, but that's for somebody else. That's not me. So to translate it into terms that I could understand, or even that Rabbi Brill could understand, would have to involve a certain translation process, which didn't exist yet. So he thought, sleep with it under your pillow and see if somehow this weird angle that I'm coming from and the text could intersect. And I did sleep with it under my pillow, but I couldn't make any sense of it for probably about 10 years, or bits and pieces started to make sense as pattern, right? Like some of the, what we could call, what's the best way to put it? The topographical areas that could be related to each other in relationships, like numerical relationships, the axioms, in broad strokes, started to come out. But then again, there was so much that I didn't understand that I didn't really know what to do with it. So 10 years later, I'm still struggling with it. And, growth is the kind of thing that it's like, watching paint dry or watching grass grow. It doesn't happen like you think it's going to happen. And you just have to go do something else and try as hard as you can. And either it happens or it doesn't. And that's what happened to me with Fountain of Wisdom. It's like gradually the growth, whatever it was, and who could even say, crept up on me and pieces started to fall together until I had the whole thing. And it took me 22 years to really get to that point where I thought that I could actually write down a commentary on it because I could account for everything. And finally, when I got to that point that I could account for everything, 22 years of work. And when I say 22 years of work with it, I mean like pretty much every day. Like that was my main text for 22 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? Okay. Now, see, I was assuming, beginning with sleeping it under the pillow, contemplating it. I'm assuming you have a semi-photographic memory in the sense that as you're reflecting on text contemplatively, you can just put that in the back burner, perhaps while you're sleeping or daydreaming, and things are working themselves out and, all the connections are forming and stuff. I assumed you set it on the back burner and kept coming back to it, but you literally kept working with it.
Well, yeah, because the pictures that I draw are almost all related to patterns in the fountain. So, in doing the drawings that I do, I'm actually working with the Fountain of Wisdom.
Interesting. Okay. Now, you mentioned this in our private discussion the other day that it took you a long time, as you said, many years to realize that everything you've been working with Kabbalistically is from the Fountain of Wisdom, but you didn't know it.
Yeah, it's the root of it. Like you could see the root of it there. And the thing that is interesting is that since the Fountain of Wisdom doesn't involve the Sphirot or the worlds, and since it has patterns that don't really match up with other texts, like the Zohar, for example, which is the basis of most Lurianic material, when it comes up or when you work with it, it's real easy to spot. It's very, very specific. It's very specific related to reflections, echoes between doubles and reflections of reflections. When the doubles, you have 4. And the basis of 4 is a quadrisection, like the cardinal points. And that is the manner in which a point can spread to the sides and, approximate a circle. So quadrisection, circles, echoes and reflections, circle to circle, is very, very kind of specific symmetrical language that the Fountain of Wisdom does. But what the Fountain of Wisdom really does, that more than its structure, than the sort of reflective crystalline structure of its echoing, that is interesting, is it communicates in what I call a psychoetheric register. It communicates in the atmospheres of consciousness. And those atmospheres are largely textural and have qualities that approximate what we could call states of being, manners of being, or modes of being. Almost as if you could say that the quality of life force arising in dimensions has specific consistencies. Textures are consistencies, and that in the mixing of them or the exploration of them as they mix, you start to see that these qualities perform very much the same kind of function as the mapping does, as the structure does. Like when you say you're in a specific world in Qabalah or a specific set of Sphirot in Qaballah. That's your map. It's possible to do this with the psychoetheric qualities as well. The textures are like a map, if you understand what I'm saying. So what the Fountain of Wisdom does is it poises this psychoetheric atmosphere within this constant state of reflection, so that the text has no beginning or end, unlike the Hishtalshelus, or the chain of creation that you get in most Qaballah, where there's a lowest and a highest, right? The Fountain of Wisdom doesn't do that. The Fountain of Wisdom really doesn't talk in terms of hierarchy. It talks about a kaleidoscopic mixing of points within each other. The point that it is really ultimately trying to make, I think, or I assume, is that in breaking the linearity or the mechanistic quality of a hierarchy, you deal with reality as a single field. And in that field, there is an alchemical process that transmutes or self-purifies the deeper that you go. And the whole idea of reconciling particular levels or stages or steps within this process is a hearkening back to a very conventional, ordinary way of conceptualizing.
Mm-hmm.
So the point that the Fountain of Wisdom makes is a very non-conceptual point.
It's very refreshing too, I find. In the modern scientific age, our ontological approach towards knowledge, everything's about references. There's a sequential progression of ideas. Even the confines of the linearity of language itself. Certain enigmas like the Fountain of Wisdom, as you were saying, it's this kaleidoscopic barrage. It's not sequential. It's extremely self-interrelated. But the non-linearity is refreshing, and that kind of reminds me of one of the patterns on the trestle board statements by Paul Foster Case, the zero one, where he says, "All the power that ever was or will be is here now."
Right.
And that would be the sort of waking ground, that baseline 0 point behind everything, outside of everything, between everything.
Right.
And it speaks also to your non-emanationist approach to Qaballah. Could you explain that to people if they're not familiar with it?
Yeah, the idea of non-emanationism goes back to the ground of phenomena, the nature of the divine. If we are dedicated in our practice to be mystics, that means essentially placing our attention on the highest, what we can call the highest, placing our attention on the divine at all times, no matter what happens, which means that no matter what rung of the ladder you're on, there's a commonality that equalizes all steps and stages. And this goes back to the very basis of manifestation, because for a normal emanationist point of view, the normal, ordinary Kabbalistic point of view, you have a conception of the divine as Ein Sof, and Ein Sof produces its light. So the light comes out of Ein Sof and then steps down from sphera to sphera, from world to world in a hierarchical pattern until it hits bottom, right? The basis of non-emanationism is by saying, first of all, no light ever came out of anywhere, that there is no stepping down of the light from Ein Sof. And certainly if that were the case, the light itself doesn't step down from Keter to Chokmah to Bina to Chesed, etc., right? World to world to world. And I'm not saying that the worlds and the principles of the Sphirot within them are not presenting themselves in that array, because they certainly are. There is certainly a structure, and I'm not denying that. The structure is self-evident. What I'm saying is that the meaning is not what it seems to be, that we could look at that structure of the worlds from subtle to gross, and we could say, sure, a rock and the etheric resonance of the most subtle aspect of luminosity are not the same. What are we, stupid? We're going to say everything's the same? No, everything's different. But on the level that they are different, there are relative differences. There is something else to consider, which is something that is no longer a relative designation. On an essential level, on an absolute level, the relative differences are not the point, right? On an essential level, on an absolute level, the divine is inherent in all phenomena. But that doesn't negate the fact that there are relative differences, right?
Yes.
So holding that paradox is the nature of the view. So the non-emanationist view states that the light of Ein Sof doesn't come out of Ein Sof. It doesn't come out of anything. Ein Sof is inherently luminous. Ein Sof is inherently open, and that openness presents itself as luminosity, and the luminosity is open, right? And it doesn't step down from level to level. It presents the variety of infinite variation without changing in and of itself ever. It's changeless. It's absolutely sourceless, changeless, and beyond intellectual understanding. However, at the same time, all kinds of intellectual differences and all sorts of apparent relative changes appear. So the essence is changeless, but it displays itself as relative change. What's so hard about that?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's the view. So if we get caught up in relative change and a mechanistic approach to classifying phenomena, we lose the forest for the trees.
From a certain perspective, I suppose they are both in their own way correct, but
Yes.
it's the veil of their perception. For instance, if you're operating, let's say, from a lower Sephiroth, or you're looking from the perspective of Malkuth, this would be relating directly to the outcome manifestations of bound objects in time and space, then all the separateness would seem to be at the forefront. That would be the most obvious thing that presents itself to us. From the perspective a bit higher, closer to Kether, perhaps, like you're saying, this timelessness, this perfection, this inability to ever lose the essence of itself, no matter how it embeds itself within anything or crystallizes for a time. It really is an issue of perspective, I suppose. Now, time is a big one, too. Time is a big one. If you were to look at, let's say, a time lapse, Koyane Scotzi comes to mind. Did you ever see that film?
Sure.
Oh, my God. Beautiful, beautiful. I saw that when I was a young child, and it was such an enigma. I watched it over and over and over again. But if you look at a sped up time lapse of, let's say, the entire planet over maybe a 3 million year span, what you would see is that every object we think of as being concrete is extremely fluid. It's constantly fluctuating, changing form, mixing, matching. I used to tell my children that rain is recycled dinosaur piss. They didn't get the joke at the time until I explained it. It's all been the same water on the planet, you know, but it's a refreshing perspective to try to remind ourselves of that infiniteness, eternalness. In a certain way, the non-emanationist approach that you take towards Qabalah, sometimes I get the feeling that it's like the work of Isaac Luria himself made manifest would be people's ability to hold that perspective of things, because I guess tikkun olam is the word that comes to mind.
Yeah.
Because from that perspective, there's no rectification required.
Well, you know, the interesting thing about it is that I don't consider myself the author of it at all. Although I came up with that term, it's really something that was always there, you know, and it's in certain mystical schools in much the same way. I see the view that I hold in a variety of different systems, and I see them even taught through methodologies that connect. Certainly, the work that I do with non-emanationism in Qabalah is very much like certain Sufi schools and certain Vajrayana schools. And for example, the Nath lineage, the Tantric Nath lineage, and some of Kashmir Shaivite tradition as well shares almost an identical view in time. So we're not talking about systems as a whole. We're talking about the way that these systems are taught. And the way that they are taught very often goes to this total emphasis on open fullness that appears, right, in a visionary register, so that whatever arises in the infinite changes of display, like you said, it doesn't have to be a discussion of substance or matter. It also involves motion and time, and the way that motion and time are calibrated, because all time is a series of designated stoppage points to try to measure a current that has an arc to it, right? Because we're really talking about motion. When you look at motion fundamentally in its most essential characteristics, it really becomes a discussion of dynamism and not about the units of change that can be described as differing states. That's just sort of the byproduct of it. The change itself is a discussion of dynamism. Dynamism all goes to the same place. It's that light that we're talking about. It's luminosity. From the point of view of my work, when we're in any discussion about dynamic luminosity, we have another term for that. We call it awareness. All right. So from the perspective that I look at that investigation, whatever is known and whatever is doing the knowing are ultimately fundamentally the same. They can't be split apart from each other. That awareness and appearance share the same fundamental ground. And on an absolute level, what knows and what is known have to return ultimately to their ground if you are interested in the mystical orientation. If you are not interested in the mystical orientation, as most people aren't, you are perfectly content with the relative ordinary view of things, in which awareness and what knows is designated as modes of consciousness, separate points of view, separate beings, and what separate beings perceive in the appearance field become objectively real states of times and places and dimensions and ideas, right? So when you have that, when you have a person or a being in a world, I'm sorry, I heard a noise. Can I pause for 1 second and go check out that noise?
Absolutely. In fact, do you mind if I take 5 and go get some more coffee?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent.
Let me just check that out.
Okay, great.
All right. Now, where were we?
Where were we? We heard the creepy sound. Did you solve the mystery?
Yeah, my wife was down there packing something.
Ah, nice.
And you know, beating up a package.
We all need to do that every now and then.
Yeah.
So let's transition, if that's okay with you. I was hoping to explore a little bit about your unique journey as a human, the human aspect, so to speak, of the occultist. As you mentioned, you began your studies and your work in Western occultism, transitioned into, on the guidance of a teacher, Hebrew Qabalah, and since then you've actually transitioned into a bit of a lesser known niche, I guess you could say, and yet you speak to the Western occult community with your writings and your teachings. What has that transition been like for you through all these years, looking back? For instance, were there certain Were there certain avenues that you felt like were dead ends perhaps, or missing
Oh,
puzzle pieces?
yeah. That's a really interesting question. Wow. I really like the fact that you phrased it like that. So do you want me to just give my bio? You want me to just give a little
Sure. Would that
account
be
of
okay?
well, it's really the only way that I can
Not the
actually
official
answer.
bio, the real one.
Yeah, I don't have one. Yeah, it's really the only way I can actually answer that question is just to tell the story. Um, because I grew up in the New York City area and came of age during the 1970s and was a completely out of control kid, right? Who was headed for no good. And when I came to my senses, I had to start over again. And that was around 1990, after having a really troublesome, turbulent first couple of decades. Starting around 1990, I wanted to become serious about the purpose of why one would want to be alive, because my previous orientation was not really pro-life in the sense of either epistemology or ontology, it really involved drugs and I'd resigned myself to the fact I thought I was going to be dead by the time I was 30, and then lo and behold, it didn't kill me. So once I made the leap and got clean from drugs, from living a certain kind of life, it just became obvious that dedication to spiritual practice was the reason why one would be alive. I mean, if it wasn't for that, I don't know what the hell else would do it. So that's not really something that I arrived at or thought about or a conclusion that I came to. It was just sort of obvious. And my manner of investigating that actually started with the lineage, one of the lineages that you just mentioned. It was, Paul Foster Case's work and BOTA. That was the first thing that I did when I became serious about my spiritual practice, and found a source for the sum total of the coursework without having to go through the pacing of the BOTA mailings that were done in a certain array, sent out from the Grand Chapter in Los Angeles in weekly increments, mixed in with the work of Ann Davies, which I was not interested in. I was just interested in Paul Foster Case's work and not the Ann Davies work. So I did all of it and then skipped over her parts. And because I had a source for this, I was able to do it. And I think her parts are like 3 or 4 years worth of work. Mm-hmm. So it took quite a bit.
And that's a sentiment shared by many Boda students as well. Nothing against Ann Davies. She was a sweet soul and she had her own kind of wisdom, but she wasn't Paul Foster Case.
Well, I just wasn't interested in what she was offering, for better or worse. It just wasn't for me. So I was involved with a couple of different sources of Hermetic Qabalah, Hermetic occultism, various lineages that I tried out. I tried out basically everything, that I could get my hands on, from the OTO to Freemasonry to Golden Dawn offshoot groups, of which I was involved with one that was this very small group that was a split off from the SRIA. And this took me into I don't know, up until mid 90s or thereabouts. And I hit a wall with it, like you said, because I don't really want to criticize these paths, but what I found was that there are certain assumptions that went unchallenged, having to do with the nature of realization and how realization was passed through methodology, through the actual practices. And there are varying opinions on this. So one opinion is that practices themselves, such as magical practices, can be done mechanistically or technically, and the techniques derive the results. If you have the proper names, you have the proper contexts in which to frame it, and an overall understanding of the phenomena and the levels that you're approaching, you get the right tools and the right words, and that somehow the method derives the result by virtue of the fact that you have the proper formula. Well, I came to find out that there's a great deal of fantasy involved in that assumption. I'm not saying that it doesn't work to produce certain results, but I'm saying that the results that I was actually seeking could not be gotten that way, and that the lineages that I had encountered that actually produced mystical results specifically were anything but mechanistic and formulaic. That what they actually did is used techniques, philosophies and techniques, as tools to pass realization from one accomplished individual to another. So the emphasis was not on the technique or the tool or the methodology and getting it right as a formula, but actually using the tool to pass living gnosis from one being to another being, which means that the beings themselves would have to demonstrate and actualize their gnosis in order to pass it, to have something to pass, right? I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, and this almost seems to speak to perhaps some of the older initiatic schools, the Egyptian ones, for instance, that produced Pythagoras and Plato, others, where, like you're saying, rather than following formula with the assumption that with Western Hermeticism, the assumption is basically that once you've memorized all of these intelligences, once you've memorized all the basics of the Hermetic tree of life, once you've memorized the tarot, astrology, correspondence this, correspondence that, blah, 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 grimoires, maybe Solomonic stuff, then of course it all leads to theurgy, right? That, theurgy is the ultimate practice. And I've come to a similar conclusion to you as well. My experience of theurgy, the instances that have seemed to be meaningful and transformative, I am convinced were that way specifically because of what my own spirit was bringing to the table with intention. And there is a large degree of imagination involved. In some of the more, I guess you could say maybe shamanic approaches, or even like Sufi mysticism, things weren't as schematic, were they, at all?
Mm-hmm. Well, then you have to consider these sort of intercessionary traditions. And what I mean by that is, take, for example, the Catholic Church, right? It's not the individual powers of the priest as a practitioner that produces the Eucharist. It's the office of the priest that the priest holds. It's the office or position that the priest holds that allows the collective lineage to derive certain results in the instance of the Eucharist. And that's what actually does the transubstantiation, right? Meaning that the priest can be an idiot. And if he's a true priest, he can perform transubstantiation. Well, that kind of model is something that I had to really think about, because if the formula model that we're talking about via sort of conventional occult orders works, at some point in the chain of initiation, there would have to be realization, or there would have to be the capacity for realization so that the office could carry it out from group to group, generation to generation. And I went in search of that missing link, that transformative link that would allow the whole thing to work. And what I found was just myself, and I can't talk about anybody else's work or anybody else's practice or anybody else's lineage, but from what I found, I didn't find an organization that could carry through its offices this intercessionary role and have it be a living thing. All that I found that actually worked were individual living beings that had some aspect of realization, who were teaching, who through philosophies and techniques could transmit it to me. But it was living because I could get to know them and look them in the eye and either delude myself based on my lived through experience at worst or grow at best. But there was no guesswork. There was no wondering where the link was in the chain, so that I had to rely upon an office to carry it to me, right? And the way that this happened was that in the mid 90s, I met an individual practicing alchemy, Tantric Alchemy, that had a small community in the Midwest. And he took me on as a student. And this is a closed community for the most part that doesn't involve a sort of a religious dogma surrounding it. So, a variety of overlaps exist. For example, this style of Tantric alchemy overlaps with certain approaches to Sufism and certain approaches to Vajrayana and certain approaches to the type of Tantra that the Hindu Nath lineage teaches. And also there is, what I've come to find out is there's quite a bit of relevance of this view, which mostly centers in the area where Central Asia meets Pakistan and Afghanistan into northern Iran, right? And there was a historical period where there was a great synthesizing of wisdom between various lineages influencing each other. And this was around the 13th century. And around this time, meaning before the Inquisition from Spain, right? Before the Inquisition from Spain, which really produced a rigidity that drove systems into themselves as separate entities through their dogma, adherence to their dogma. But before that, in the early Middle Ages, there was this tremendous overlapping of ideas from Sufism to Vajrayana to mystical Christianity and to Judaism, because there were Jews in Afghanistan 1,000 years ago, right? So what I found in the Fountain of Wisdom later on was evidence of this influence. And what I had learned with this particular teacher of Tantric alchemy, I saw written all over the Fountain of Wisdom. And that's what drove me to work with it for 22 years. But I never stopped working with this particular teacher. And this teacher actually sent me to the Jews in Brooklyn to learn Qabalah from the standpoint of the Hasidic and the yeshiva context. But I was doing both at the same time. So this caused me to digest 3 languages, right? The language of Tantric alchemy, the language of Hebrew Qabalah that has these different versions, including the Lurianic one. I had to digest, Zohar and all that stuff, and Hermetic occultism, which is where I came from. And that was already there by the time I did these other things. So with these 3 elements present, after another 20 years, and I started to write books and make graphic representations, it was pretty obvious that these systems were talking to each other in a syncretic way, and that where it could really be of the most benefit and use was practitioners who seemed kind of, to me at least, starving for certain things that their systems didn't contain. And it seems to me that for example, and let's just go from each end, Jewish Kabbalists have no idea what Hermetic Kabbalists are doing. Hermetic Kabbalists have very little idea what the Jewish Kabbalists are doing, but that's changed since, for example, figures like Aryeh Kaplan. And those who participate in these devotionally oriented living mystical systems, such as we find in certain schools of Qabalah and in Sufism and in Vajrayana, this provides a sort of pure voltage, devotional voltage, that the occultists don't even think exists. And since I had tastes of these things and could bring them together, what I thought was that the group that I wanted to talk to most was the place where I started from, with Hermetic Qaballah and Hermetic occultism. So if I could take the benefit of some of what many of those readers haven't seen yet, if I could do it properly, which is always the challenge because I'm a wordy kind of overly complex guy, if I don't clog it up too much, I could put it where it would be of most use. And that's what happened with the various books that I started to write, is that I wanted to pour water on the dried up plant that needed it, and I got some good water from these different places. I mean, I really had the benefit of some excellent teachers, some amazing, patient, kind teachers who would bear with me because I'm a difficult dude. I'm a pain in the ass, and my teachers were really generous with me, continue to be really generous with me. And all of these things I'm still doing. It's not like I went from one system to the other. I'm still doing them all because they all actually connect. And I'm not a New Ager, and I don't think that all systems connect with each other. But these three systems connect with each other.
Well, they seem to come from a similar source, as you pointed out.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Many people would disagree with me.
And to this day, you live on and off in retreat, as you say.
No, I'm a full-time retreatant.
Full-time retreatant. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I did years of formal retreats. I did, for example, 3 years of formal retreats, and most of those retreats were silent retreats. In order to do that, my wife moved out of the house so I could be alone in the house. Got a place down the street, and she would bring me my meals and stuff. My wife takes care of me in retreat. That's part of her practice, is to take care of me while I do this work of this type. She's a pujari of sorts. It has to do with her spiritual work. Kind of difficult to describe. I would let her describe it rather than try to, put words in her mouth. But I'm a full-time retreatant, which means that I don't have other interests or responsibilities or things like that. I don't live in formal retreat anymore, obviously, because I'm talking. My years of formal retreat in silence were very formal. They were strict. And I did that in Brooklyn. So for somebody to, come and tells me that, you have to go to some place to do that, nonsense. You could do it anywhere, right? Retreat is in the mind. It's not in the geographic location, So now I just dedicate myself to this work, and whatever comes up hopefully becomes part of the work. So to me, that's retreat. The gestalt is retreat. It doesn't mean I don't listen to music and eat food, for example, obviously, but that becomes part of divine service. If music isn't a sort of devotional act where one binds and unifies consciousness with the divine, I don't know what it is. To me, that's all it is. So aesthetics and inquiry, curiosity, they are part of retreat. And in this new book, Quintessence of Secret Mercury, that's one of the books that's coming out this week, actually. There is a text that comes from my formal retreat years that was started around 2011 that I worked on during all those years in retreat in Brooklyn, that I revised about 5 years ago and finally refined to the point where I seem to be able to answer and address all the questions that were lingering through these years. So it's basically a 10-year retreat text called Quintessence of Secret Mercury. It is the text that gave the book its title. And that's in there. And the funny thing about it is that starting in 2011, I was talking about a symbol system and a methodology and a way of describing how this path functions, the path that I practice functions, before I even understood intellectually what all these parts meant. It was a very odd thing that the majority of the material that came about in that text and other texts came about through a series of ways that were sort of indirect. For example, hypnagogic states, semi-dream states, where I would just sort of be like taking dictation, and I would have symbols and levels and patterns. And I knew that they related to what I was doing, but I didn't really have the perspective at that point of view, or in many points of view, to stop and analyze them. I just sort of recorded them. And they became full of meaning later, like they had to ripen through investigation. And eventually I mapped them all out into one huge system that I broke down to 32 parts. It became my system called the 32 Keys, in which I took an overview of the entire path as I understood it and broke it down into 32 steps and printed them out on cards. Way before that book was a book idea, I was using those cards to understand, or to try to understand and investigate, just what the hell am I actually doing here? And I would bring them to people, discuss them. I really poured over them before I released it. And eventually I had them printed up, wrote a commentary on it, and that became the 32 Keys. So the book's totally sold out now. I'm about to go into a second printing of it.
There will be a second printing soon.
Probably. I mean, I have to make some of my money back on the new books first.
Yeah, and in that regard, that process you were speaking to there, it reminds me of the voltage of infusing these old forgotten systems into both Hebrew and Hermetic Qabalah. There's a sort of an inverse approach that is tangible, I think, in your work, where, as you mentioned, it's not so much that you're following a map and then going through the motions. You're diving right into the source and then trying to extract the map. And you can see that sort of coming out and building up in your work. And the first book of yours that I read was The Awakening Ground. Had a beautiful hardcover version of it. And even since then, with your two latest releases, I can see a tremendous accrual taking place, so to speak, because your work is constantly ongoing and it's building upon itself. And it seems like I don't know what you'll think of this observation, but your entire work that you've devoted yourself to and you're pouring yourself into and manifesting it as we speak, it seems to be centralizing around a central core that it's constantly drawing from. And as time goes by, it's simply building upon itself over time.
Well, there is a central core, and the central core obviously is the divine, but that's a very general kind of thing. So how does one approach the divine spark that through the singularity of that spark becomes the whole of it, right? Well, that's why there is a lineage. That's why there are teachers, right? And that's how one views one's teacher. Like, to me, the spark that expresses the whole of it is the spark of my teacher's capacity to hand me what he has, and his teacher to him, and his teacher before him to him, and on and on and on and on. And that's what a lineage is. And I'm in a lineage that's 1,600 years old, and either the realization is real or it isn't. And the only way you can judge it is on the one talking to you, sitting there looking you in the eyes, because I don't know the other guys, they're gone, right? So I trust my teacher, and we've worked together for almost 25 years now. So if there is a gold standard for me, it's down to one person. And that's not, I'm not saying that that one person is the end all and be all for all humanity. What I'm saying is that's what I have to work with. And that's the view that one has with what one ultimately has to make a choice to get off the train at a stop. You can't get all the stops if you stay on the train, right? You can't shop around for life and get anywhere. You can't, dig the multiple holes and expect it to go deep enough to be a well. You dig a well, you dig one hole, you keep digging, until you hit water. And eventually you got to pick a spot. So I picked this spot with this one teacher, and that's what I approach as my gold standard, because this person, when I first met them, was more advanced than anybody else that I'd met. So I made them the stop, but it's not them that's doing it. It's the divine through them. That's why the person is what they are and would be effective as a teacher, because what they would be transmitting would be something that can't be reduced to any person, place, or thing, or realm, or system. You can't even reduce it to a system. The whole of the divine is incomprehensible. It's the unutterably vast, open fullness of mystery itself, which can't be spoken of or reduced to language. You can't even be reduced to symbol, right? It's the source of all symbols and all communication and all meaning. It's what I call the meaning of meaning. Like relative meanings are specific meanings, they're specific things. But what is meaning in and of itself, right? What is that fullness that makes meaning mean something in itself?
It is more experiential than verbally communicative, that's for sure.
Yeah, you can't put your finger on it, and it's useless to try, right? So, there's this idea of chasing the divine in a sort of general amorphous sense as being a model that would probably dissipate into nothing for most people. But with the aid of a lineage or a teacher, and specifically one that translates methodologies, you always have those who are ahead of you to look to as a model, right? And I don't just have the one teacher, there's other individuals as well. And it's a whole community. And that's been, made all the difference for me in my work. And without that, I think that I would be struggling with my nose in a book. And what I'm talking about is not in books.
Living mysticism.
Right. Yep. It's not in a book. The books are nice, but the books ultimately will fail.
Yes. And oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much for your time, David. It truly was an honor and a pleasure to have you.
Sure. Thank you.
And yeah, your latest books are fantastic. I cannot recommend them highly enough. So yeah, Quintessence of Secret Mercury and The Fountain of Wisdom. We'll post links in the video description. And how can people reach out to you if they want to get in touch, David?
Well, my wife, Rachel, who does everything to keep me alive, handles all the business and like all the Facebook and all the email lists and websites and all of that. She also puts the books together. She's a graphic designer.
Oh my goodness.
30 years in the business.
Tell her thank you on all of our behalf. Thank you.
she's really good. I mean, she's a retired graphic designer who worked in the corporate world for a really long time. Books in print, so doing exactly this. And she does all the layout, oversees the printing. I've published books with publishers, but what I found is that we do it better ourselves. So now we just put out the books ourselves, and I don't go through the publishers. I mean, I have some out with Inner Traditions. I've had some out with Fulgur Press and another small one in Scotland called Dot Press. But now we just put them out. And Rachel does the communications with people, and she announces these books and has forms on the website. You can order it direct from the website. But I really shouldn't say too much more because I always get it confused. I'm not really so good with practical stuff. I know you can order the books from us somehow.
I'll post the links for the audience.
And she's really good at packing them and sending them.
Oh yeah, the quality is fantastic. Yeah, and I believe you're also teaching sort of like webinar classes or live feeds with select individuals.
I did 32 Zoom classes on my 32 keys system. And this Sunday, it's Wednesday now. Mm-hmm. This Sunday is the very last one. And we have them all online. And for a nominal fee, for a modest surcharge, one can view the cleaned up versions of the Zoom classes with added graphics and hijinks placed upon them by a series of highly trained individuals. And you could go through the entire system. It's basically an overview of the system, like I said before, based on these 32 graphic images. So I talk about them, but they're reduced to symbols. And, you know, it's very interesting to work that way because that's actually part of what the books don't communicate, is that you need an oral tradition, but the oral tradition usually is not based off of some like complex written theoretical discourse. It's based off of symbols. So here we have just a pure presentation of symbol and then oral commentary on it. So it's really kind of the way that I think teaching goes best with at least my material. You know, symbols and what we call a homiletical discourse.
Awesome. Well, any closing words for the audience? Anything last you want to share with us while we're here?
Closing words for the audience. Yeah. When I put out these books, I'm really only giving the benefit of the work that I've done in my own practice. So I would encourage people not to look at them as some sort of definitive system, like I'm giving forth something in its complete state. I'm not. I'm giving a taste of my own practice, which is terminally incomplete, right? So there's a different kind of mentality that than people are used to when they have, for example, religious traditions, where you get a religious text that purports to be the beginning, middle, and end, and one adheres to it in a way that approaches it as a complete statement, right? What I put out is not a complete statement. It is a living, ongoing, self-refining, self-purifying thing that purports, since it's in the form of different volumes, to get better and better over time and refine itself over time. I can only do the work of a practitioner and put that out. So the mistake would be to see it falsely as definitive. And I'm putting this out as a warning, because if you try to look at it as some sort of definitive path, you'll be disappointed, because it can't do that. If that made sense.
That makes perfect sense. I, for one, I'm sure many others, especially in the 21st century, feel this way, that perhaps there is something much needed in all of the systems out there to allow for an acceptance of a bit of open-endedness, a bit of personal nuance, and a bit of incompleteness. Because if it were all complete and nice and tidy, there'd be nothing any of us could add to it or remove from it.
Well, if I pretended that it was definitive, you know, I'd be a phony, and it would be no good at all. It wouldn't work. You know, the whole thing here is borne out in whether or not people grow by contact with what you're putting out. And the growth is the reason for it and the proof of its efficacy. So, you know, to avoid that problem before it would ever start, I, you know, state up front, this is just a reflection of my own imperfect practice. And all credit, anything that needs credit would be credit to the divine.
And I had never heard the term spiritual cartographer until you.
Esoteric cartography. Yeah, it's a term that I use because the way that I make compositions when I do visual work ultimately refers to the parts of the metaphysical territories, we could say, for lack of a better term, that are inherent in my practice. And I could always find the different parts mapped out against each other on the page. Every time I go to make a composition, that happens automatically. So it occurred to me very early on in the making of these things that this was a form of map making. It was a form of cartography, because every part had its place and the places spoke to each other in relation to each other. The relationships produced the content. So to me, that's a map. It's not a map like to get from here to there. It's a simultaneous series of relationships that is sort of open-ended and infinite.
Yes.
Right. It's what we could call, and I don't even know anything about physics, but this is a term that I hear from physics. It's like a superpositioning of relationships, like an infinite amount of transparent relationships to each other.
And the relationships are clearly alchemical in the way you depict them as well, too. Far beyond any two-dimensional schemata of, okay, in this diagram, you know, this Hebrew letter corresponds here, that one corresponds there, blah, blah, blah. There's a few interactions. Your work is like, theoretically, it's in some of your depictions, I completely try to ignore your descriptions and just extract whatever the image is telling me.
Good.
And it seems almost like a more four-dimensional representation of, along the lines of something like Splendor Solace would be depicting with alchemical vessels, because the Hebrew letters themselves, with placement and combination to all of the other activity going on, you have what appear to be digestive organs and calcination, you know, fumigations, and in that regard, the relationship of the symbols truly is infinite and living. It's not like some dead completed map, so to speak. It's all these little activities and functions and combinations emerging.
Well, there is a set of elements that are doing what alchemical elements do, inherent, demonstrable from the beginning within spiritual work. There is a fire. It is life force. When we place our attention anywhere, a certain amount of life force or fire is generated, and that fire can be cultivated and stoked to produce heat and pressure, meaning the intensity that we place our attention on life force to utilize life force produces more heat and pressure. So that's what alchemy uses as its catalytic force. As a result of that, there is a set of frozen potentialities that most certainly melt and become fluid, right? In other words, we liberate the essentiality of that which is hidden from us through the heat and pressure of rising life force to pay attention to it, right? And eventually this liberated fluidity, and alchemically we call the frozen away aspect of the divine, the salt of Mercury, a Mercury salt. Salt in the sense that it's crystallized and made hard and conceals what's behind it. When the heat and pressure of life force through attention melts the salts into a fluid state, and they start to become nimble, liberated, effulgent, right? That effulgence, and without getting into the whole symbolism of directionality, you could say that the fire blazes up and the fluidity drips down. And ultimately, the rising heat and pressure of the flame and the fluid crystalline dew of awareness that has been awoken from its sleep, the two coalesce with each other. And it's in that coalescence that one refines what is ultimately referred to as the philosopher's stone, right? And from the system that I utilize, the way that I use the symbolism, that stone is cultivated in the heart. But the heart of what? Right? Because we're not talking merely about the heart of a human being, because what's a human being? Or the heart of some world somewhere, because both macrocosm and microcosm are ultimately conceptual designations that posit a knower and a thing known, meaning the microcosm thinks that it is itself, that it knows, and the macrocosmic universe, we think that's objectively real. Both assumptions are totally wrong from the standpoint of the view that I'm talking about. So when macrocosm and microcosm cease to become separate from each other and barriers to each other, ultimately, the fluidity and the blaze coalesce in the heart of a placeless place. That which cannot be situated in the hierarchy, mechanistic, linear hierarchy of a conceptual contrivance of reality, right? The heart of the mystery itself, which is co-emergent with our own heart that we perceive, but is not reduced to it, right? So and this is probably why the overarching emphasis of my alchemical system is devotion and devotional, because this place where the coalescence happens and the crystallization of the stone happens is the heart. And the heart is associated with a series of reactions within knowing that are central to one's being, right? So we're not certainly talking about the heart in some sentimentalist emotional sense or a psychological sense. We're also not talking about archetypes in the collective unconscious, a la Jung here. We're talking about something that words cannot really describe, but you could get it from another person.
Yes.
You know.
You go into, thank you for that. And you go into great detail about that specific process you were mentioning there in your new book, The Quintessence of Secret Mercury.
Yeah. Sorry for drawing it out.
No, thank you. No, thank you. That's beautiful. And as you were speaking, I was remembering when I was reading over that certain parts of the text that talk about the melting of the salt, so to speak, the mercury salt. And oddly, there's something really beautiful about your writing and your work, David. I mean it. There are certain sentences that I come across in your work, specifically on that section you were talking about, the release, so to speak, the release of the combination of those two within the fire. And I remember being flooded with senses of deja vu, as well as implications about a potential future, as well as a wondering about how this process actually may be occurring all around us, even if we're not noticing at times. It gets you thinking. It gets you thinking for sure.
Well, I'm certainly willing to talk further. I don't know when you want to stop the interview or if you have
let's
to
keep
go.
going. Okay, good.
Yeah, because I definitely have something to say about that. When those lines come up, and I know what you're talking about in my work when it does that, when those lines come up, or when passages like that come up in my drawings and I look at them, I understand what you're talking about. And I always realize I don't understand how it happened. I can't sit down and make those parts do that thing that I can't do. Like I can't do that, but it happens somehow. So it always perplexes and bothers me a lot, because I would want to do that all the time. I'd want to write like that all the time or draw like that all the time, but it only comes out when it comes out. And that's on grace. That's not on me. Like that's beyond, like the whole point is to set yourself up as a vehicle for that to happen. But once it does, you can't take credit for it. It's not you. And if it happens, it happens. Years can go by and it might not happen. Right. But that's the goal, to be patient, and to allow something to work through you that it not only dwarfs you, it annihilates you. I mean, there's no room for you there.
Yeah, time stands still when you come across those instances. And it could have been something you've seen a million times or maybe read once or twice before, and you go back and read it and bam, it hits you.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
the downside of that is that you're stuck with all the work that isn't that you
Yes.
have to go through to get that. And it's you do the best you can. So I'm hoping that people will be patient enough with my work to sift through it and find things that are meaningful, because I do think that they are there, but I think that there's a variety of things there. And it is what it is. At a
Is what
certain
it is.
point, you just got to put it out. You know, but there is not that much control that I can have over the process. I am not in control over the process. So as a result of that, it becomes not very structural and very open-ended. And the good thing about something like writing commentary on the Fountain of Wisdom or first 3 chapters of Genesis is that you're writing a structured book. So in a way, you don't have to worry about that with a book like that. So certain types of books, they will serve that structural purpose. They'll be cohesive from beginning to end. They'll have a starting point, they'll have an ending point, and they'll function that way. And that's a very, very nice thing if you do the other a lot, if you do the open-ended thing, to have a structured thing. So, and there are things in between as well. For example, this new book, Quintessence of Secret Mercury, has an image cycle. And the image cycle was originally a mutus liber, like the great alchemical text from the 17th century. But that's a style. That's not just one book. In other words, a wordless text. And I completed that particular image text and then put commentary on it. It could never have been done if the words and the images happened at the same time. I mean, it had to be the mutus liber and then the commentary put upon it. It could be the other way around as well, but that would be a very different type of thing.
It's
So
interesting. Yeah, and it's interesting to imagine if you had left it as a mutus liber and allowed someone else to put the commentary on, how different the message would have been, of course.
Well,
you probably wouldn't allow that, but
introduce me to that person.
Sure.
I'd love to meet that person.
Oddly enough, I was just thinking of Adam McLean, Adam McLean, the alchemy, specialist with the best website of collected images of Renaissance alchemy ever. His books are fantastic. His commentary on the Mutus Liber was really astute, I believe. But he was always strictly focused to Western alchemy, Renaissance alchemy specifically. I don't know what kind of commentary a fellow like that would have on your work because of the heavy instance of Hebrew Qabalah. But I should reach out and ask him just out of curiosity, because he's one of the best,
Well, he knows my work really well. He's got a whole thing on my work on his website.
Does he? I never even knew that. I must have missed that.
He's got a whole chapter on me on his website.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, you've got to be probably one of the first alchemical cartographers or artists, if you will, that he's featured, I suppose, with a gap of what, like 200 years compared to other sources?
He's in it there. He has a section for contemporary alchemical image makers, I guess. I mean, I really haven't looked at it in a long time, so I don't know what it's called, but there are others in there. It's not just me.
Okay.
But he definitely has a very specific bias. He is, I do believe that he believes in substance, material substance.
It was interesting a little while ago on the social medias. He started announcing that, he was looking back over as many decades of research into alchemy. And like you mentioned, he basically announced that he thinks a lot of it was imaginary. A lot of it was off the mark. And he's kind of I guess you could say, a material scientist, so to speak.
That's right. That's exactly what I was referring to.
Yep.
I could be wrong, but my impression is that his emphasis is definitely not mysticism.
Which, oddly enough, and see, this is the beauty of how authors and artists and how all of your work can affect people in unknown ways, because whether or not he thinks certain conclusions or postulations of the old alchemists were imaginary or off the mark. People who read his books may have still found something of value, of true value, of mystical value, that he himself, the author, might say, oh, that's just rubbish. It's all imaginary stuff. But that doesn't change the benefit that certain mystics might glean from his work.
Well, you're looking at one of those people, because one of the books that had a tremendous impact on me at a very, very important juncture of my life, like around 1991, 1992, was his book, The Alchemical Mandala.
That was my book.
Yeah.
No,
I'm sorry. Carry that around with me.
Get this. That was me too. In fact,
Yeah.
that was what. Okay, so while I was a psychonaut as a teenager, after an ET encounter, I was reading a bunch of metaphysical stuff and practicing with, developing psychic skills and blah, blah, blah. Anyways, in all of my 20s, I tried to walk away from it, stay down to earth, just be normal, ignore all the metaphysical woo-woo stuff. It wasn't until I was approaching 30, right before my divorce, actually, and home fire. I had a home fire divorce. It was right around that time I discovered that book that you mentioned, the Alchemical Mandala. And that was it. When I read that book, I said, holy crap, Eric, Western Hermeticism is what's calling you. And that was what.
Yeah, that book is a monster. That book is a monster.
Yeah.
And it's not even what's written in the book. It's the things that are suggested that are left open.
Symbolic wisdom. It's the beauty of symbolic wisdom.
Right. Plus all the images that when you line them up, when you take all those images, which belong to these very specific contexts, like you take an image that belongs to an image cycle that relates to somebody's system, right? That's cohesive in and of itself. And you take out one image from that cycle, and then you take out one image from all these other cycles. Right. And then you start to see the commonalities between them outside of their context where they usually function.
Sure.
You're doing this third thing, right? You're now with a bird's eye view.
Then you're extracting an alphabet that's interchangeable.
Oh, it's a vocabulary that you couldn't get any other way. And it was sort of inevitable that what grew up in the Renaissance in the form of these various systems would eventually filter through our sort of information driven synthesis in that kind of way, where you would have connections being made that the original authors might or not have had any interest in whatsoever. But ultimately, I think the one thing that kept it all together was the great work, the overarching divine service at the heart of every single one of these individual systems. But the methodologies differed so much. And there were Kabbalistic images in there. It's been a long time since I looked at it, but there was one from Rosenroth's books, I believe, in there, and a Lully image in there. And, that book has.
How fascinating that between you and me, that was one of the quintessential books. That's
I had a soft cover version of it.
Me too. And I long since gave it away. I gift books to people all the time.
Mine has
I think
bite
I have
marks
in
it. And I just loved it to death. And a few of his others, for example, that was written in conjunction with Jocelyn Godwin, I believe, right?
I believe so. You did the forward.
Yeah. He also wrote a commentary on the work of Robert Flood that was around the same time, equally as influential for me.
And see, one of the most famous images from Robert Flood, it's a sideways depiction of a caricature of a man, and you have the sort of overlaid and outerlaid etheric emanations with some Kabbalistic text and things. I've often wondered if Alex Gray stole his basic template of style from Robert Flood, because it looks like an older Alex Gray in black and white, if you catch my drift.
Well, Alex Gray was a medical illustrator, and he was used to showing transparencies of the nervous system, the skeletal system, and as a medical illustrator would. And the image that you're talking about functions through transparency. It's like the head in profile is transparent, and this is the deeper process that's going on inside the mind of the individual. I mean, that's the sort of vernacular of it. So I know what you're talking about. Yeah, certainly. there would be a hell of a lot that Adam McLean and I would agree on, more than we would disagree on, probably. I've never actually met him.
Out of curiosity, this is a bit of a random question. Since you went through a firm affiliation with Western occultism, were there any aspects of or were there any specific arcane sciences that you kind of felt served no particular use or interest for you specifically?
What do you mean?
Well, you figure there's a bundle of arcane sciences in Western occultism. You have tarot, you have Qabalah, you have astrology, you have alchemy, and that could be distinguished between, physical alchemy and spiritual alchemy or mental alchemy and sacred geometry, etc. I guess you could even do the subsets of talisman casting or Enochian or Solomonic grimoire workings, theurgy, etc. After acquainting yourself with all of those rudiments and tools, were there any specifics that you knew kind of early on didn't serve much purpose for you, that you weren't interested in?
Well, every single thing that you just mentioned is a tool. And the question is, to what end do you use the tool? I don't think that any esoteric science is a goal in its own right. It's all part of a greater aim, greater intention, which is to realize the ineffable, to realize the divine. So everything that you just mentioned also has its place. So all of those things are valuable in their own context, provided that the big picture is squared away. The only problem that I see is not with the tools, it's with the orientation towards the big picture. So no, I don't have any problem with anybody's tool, whether I use it or not, but I definitely have a problem with esoterica for its own sake. When it becomes a sort of solipsistic loop, right? Whenever any of these tools becomes a loop, bad things happen. You become trapped in an orthodoxy, right? And for esotericists to think that only the exoteric systems have orthodoxies, they are wrong.
Believe you me, they're out there. They're everywhere. I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think it's hard to even assign fault to the existence of those orthodoxies. They seem to naturally arise,
Yeah, that's just what human beings do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Human beings produce orthodoxies because form is evident, and that which is essential, that is the inherent nature of that form, is so elusive that we miss it. So because of the nature of our own habits, we see forms as finite appearances and we become trapped in their finiteness. When you lose sight of the infinite within the apparently finite display, you run the risk of doing this. It's just what happens to human beings, that we mistake the infinite for the finite display that presents it. I mean, and of course, this happens on a moment by moment basis with a practitioner. Like if a practitioner strives to realize the infinite, but the array seems to be finite appearances, of course, these will become obstructions unless there is enough wherewithal to penetrate and go through them, which requires such an enormous momentum of trajectory that the individual can't sustain continuously. It is impossible for an individual to sustain that much momentum. So we are constantly holding a view that we fall from. And we fall and get up again and fall and get up again and fall and get up again. And hopefully over time, we get better at it. But we have to understand that that's just inevitable. This is the basis of the game. This is how it has to work. There has to be a falling from view. There has to be a falling into unconsciousness trapped within the finite. Because the game, if you want to call it that, or the great work, is that the infinite contrives a situation whereby it appears to be trapped within the finite. Appears to be. That doesn't mean that the finite is ever finite. The finite is secretly infinite. But how would we know that unless enormous transformation were to occur from our habit-based state? So we're born into a habit-based state on various levels, whatever resource we happen to have available to us through the powers of our own curiosity and awareness. And the idea of falling from view and forgetting, and then remembering once again, even if it's like, split seconds after each other or days go by or whatever it is, falling into forgetting, which is a habituated sleep-like mechanical robotic state, and awakening into remembering at least the inkling of the spark of what it would be to resume one's practice again in an authentic and genuine manner. This is something that I don't think an individual can even do. I think it requires a lineage to do this, or contact with a lineage, or contact with a resource outside of one's own powers. I think it's too much for one person. To think that we could go it alone, I just don't see the evidence that that ever works. Because what takes over, if one keeps being a practitioner, is fantasy, and a fantasy relationship to what one is as a practitioner. And you don't have to put in a lot of effort to see people parading around in costumes and assuming caricature-like versions of themselves, which are purely fantastic. They're pure fantasy. And so you ask yourself, well, why does it go to this ridiculous, absurd extreme in people where occultism becomes a fashion statement? How does that happen? Well, it happens because identity is so tantalizing to a human being, right? Portraying yourself as an identity, identifying with an image-based, superficial synopsis of what one is, like subscribing to an image that presents your identity to the world so you can conceptualize yourself as having that identity, right? That is part of the fantasy. Yeah. It's the exact opposite of what the work is, actually.
And every true system has always warned against vanity. I think in the West, with our Christian dominance, developmentally, culturally, the whole warning against vanity it's missed as being from the perspective of a sin or something that's punishable, so to speak. But the punishment is what you bring on your own self if you get stuck in vanity, basically, because it's a detriment. It's a hindrance. It's a hindrance to what really matters.
Yeah, it's essentially ego.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the idea of being trapped in ego is inevitable for any being, human being, and especially for a practitioner, because there is ego attached with the conception of wisdom, conception of having wisdom, being near wisdom, and of course, the real danger is associated with power, the acquisition of power, because, like I was saying before, once life force is cultivated and the heat and pressure of life force becomes more than naturally is generated by an individual, once the fires are stoked through attention and really a tremendous amount of life force is present, that is a feeling of a certain kind of power. And there are things that one can do with that life force, which are basically aspects of power. There, you can manipulate it. It can be manipulated. It could be driven to do different things, to change one's circumstance. And that's a very dangerous area, because the motivation to change one's circumstance or manipulate one's circumstance is extremely delicious. So how does one not do that once it becomes evident that one can do that? Well, you're going to have your hand in the cookie jar at some point.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about like gross level miracles or things that are silly in like a horror film kind of way. I'm really talking about things that most often happen psychologically. That the kind of power manipulation happens within one's own mind, where meanings become extremely exaggerated and one feels that there is a control over how meaning presents itself, which there is. Of course, you can make your mind do these exaggerated things, and there's evidence that it actually is happening. And I do think it's real. So to be trapped in that requires a tremendous tikkun, a tremendous redemption. So, it all comes back to having a view or a lineage or even an individual person who kicks your ass when you get out of line. I think it is very, very important.
I recall two recommendations when it comes to approaching wisdom. There's curiosity and there's pain. That those are the two great teachers. Take your pick, basically.
Well, there is a stage of alchemical work of the contemplative kind which is referred to as the way of pain. It's a stage of development where the burden of identity and identification and the mind's idiosyncrasies become hot within themselves in a register that irritates all the sensibilities associated with our habits and how we think and feel. And at a certain point, it becomes so hot. And we're not talking thermally here, of course. We're talking about life force producing an amount of voltage that is uncomfortable. That the way that our winds and channels, the subtle pipes and the ruach that produces the effect of reality in our being, the way that it's configured at a certain point is so small and constricted that when we generate enough of this voltage running through that internal subtle system that is not supple or big enough to hold it, it really hurts. And I'm not saying that metaphorically. It hurts. It hurts a lot. And this, of course, it takes a lot of work to do this, but it feels like you can really damage yourself, which you can in various ways. But the most important thing, if you have enough supervision and methodological wherewithal to work through it, is that pain actually expands the channels that carry the ruach, the internal pipes of our being that are mostly in knots with each other, and they literally straighten themselves out and become uncrimped, and the knots loosen and expand and become able to carry increasingly higher levels of this life force voltage and a greater velocity of its transmission, meaning it goes faster and deeper and bigger. And the way of pain ultimately settles, and that's where bliss states start. Bliss states actually seem to be the reaction of those channels having gone through the pain of constriction and then ultimately settling into a more open state. That when the voltage pours through it, the great outpouring. And also the amazing thing is, like, it's not even moving that much. Just a little motion in the winds and channels of an individual feels like all hell broke loose. So somebody who's really experienced what I'm talking about would see this happening to like a minute degree in a practitioner, but that practitioner would think it was like they got hit by a truck. And the amazing thing is that it actually works, because once those changes happen, they kind of happen permanently.
In this let's see. I'm trying to wonder how to formulate this question here. What is the major difference that you have noticed between Tantric alchemy, so to speak, or at least the lineage that you work with, and Hermetic Qabalah? Because you translate a lot of the teachings of that Tantric alchemy into Western occultism language-wise for the reader. Do you feel that there's specific parts of that system that are completely operating on a different language? Or is it something that's easy enough to simply translate into a new occult format for people to work with who maybe have no experience with Tantric alchemy, if that makes sense?
Well, we got to get very specific about what we're talking about here, because I can't make a blanket generalization about Hermetic Qabalah, because there are so many different systems and views and lineages that we would have to talk about very specific ones for me to make some kind of comment on it. And they would have to be ones that I've had experience with. But the name comes from the Renaissance. You know, Hermetic Qabalah comes from the time after Pico, when the Ficinos had the Corpus Hermeticum translated, and they were starting to bring in things from the Jewish world into the court of the Medicis, and then it was disseminated amongst scholars and practitioners, and took root and formulated a sort of alternate system from what the Jews were doing. And that took a few centuries to codify. So by the time you get Hermetic Qabalah in the 17th and 18th centuries and the 19th century, there were a lot of different points of view, and some of them were more complete than others, and some of them were missing parts that others had or didn't have. So the only way I could answer that question is to say that the kaleidoscopic array of Hermetic Qabalah, you're talking about a series of incomplete statements that seem to overlap with each other, where parts are missing, and one person might have something that another person might not have, and back and forth and back and forth. With Tantric alchemy, you're starting from a realized individual who has all the parts and is really passing that wholeness through whatever methodology they have. That's what attracted me to it. You're starting with realization, and the path is based on that result, and methodologies that reproduce that result successfully or unsuccessfully from one point to another point and are passed like that. I don't think that the Western systems operated that way for the most part. Some of them might. However, how many of those completist resultant systems survived and were able to survive in their methodology to this day intact? That's the question, because it seems that most of them stopped or died at a certain point and fragments remained.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That actually clarifies a bit of what I was trying to ask. And I suppose my real question was, in Western Hermetic systems, there's not much reference made to Kundalini yoga. So perhaps what I was really wondering is there a difference between the Tantric alchemy that you practice versus traditional Kundalini yoga? Or would it be the same thing?
No, it's not the same thing. The systems that use that term in the way that Hindu lineages do, for example, the Nath lineage, are using life force in a very specific way. It's an aspect of what, in my particular case, the methodology was, but it's not the point. It's just one of the tools that is used to generate the heat and pressure that I was talking about, where life force is cultivated through attention. Like, for example, we don't do Shaktipat, which is something that in systems of Kundalini yoga, they rely upon, and sort of, for some systems, becomes the point of it. So no, it's quite different from that style of practice. However, there is quite a bit of overlap in Qabalah with that system. For example, what is the role of the Nachash in the Garden of Eden, the serpent in the Garden of Eden? I mean, that is most definitely talking about the redemption of life force and the proper use of life force. Because remember, the symbol of the serpent in the Garden of Eden was a serpent that stood vertically, upright, and spoke. And we know from our study of Sefer Yetzirah that there is a male and female, or red and white, form of the serpent force called the Teli and the Galgal, the hanging display of all of reality and the hidden cycles that perpetuate it, right? So you could make a pretty good case for saying that there is something like a Kundalini system within the literature pertaining to the red and white drops in alchemical terms, where the Teli and the Galgal, the male and female aspects of the serpent, are finally married to each other to complete the Nachash. So the Nachash could be used as a sacrifice, because ultimately the point of the serpent in the Garden of Eden was not expressed in the biblical text. The point is that the beast of the field would become the sacrifice. Ultimately, life force is used sacrificially. It's not an end in and of itself. It's meant to be burned through, like the Olah, burnt on the altar of one's practice. Right. So the question is not realizing this Kundalini force, it's what one ultimately does with it. I hope that answered your question.
It does, thank you. Just pondering that. As an end goal or an orientation approaching the work, the sacrificial element is very important then.
Yeah, it's in that sacrifice that the perceiver and that which is perceived are annihilated. That the separation of the subject and the object, or the subjective and the objective, or subjectivity and objectivity as principles, are annihilated at the root, at their root. And that root is their common ground. That root is the Or Ein Sof. That's all Ein Sof is. Ein Sof is the annihilation of the baggage imputed upon that dynamism, that clarity, that transparency, which is infinite in and of itself, but can present itself as myriad infinite finite variations without changing its essential meaning. When that is realized, the smoke of the smoldering flesh of the beast of the field is accepted. That's Tikkun Olam. That's what Tikkun Olam actually is, from my own perspective. But, you know, we approach this work through a series of vantage points that are appropriate with what we're able to do. You know, I mean, first we start with the intellect by understanding, for example, teachings and symbols and techniques. And a lot of that really has to do with reversing habitual tendencies, right? Like the main work of the intellect at first is going against every natural, habitual, automatic impulse in the book, right? From
like
there,
the Buddhist koan comes to mind. Anything to sort of stop you in your tracks and potentially reorient.
That's right, because if you keep doing what you're doing, you know what the result is going to be. It's very predictable. It's like, you like the world you have now? Well, just keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, stay stuck there as long as you want. Keep on doing it. Yeah.
Right, because we know what the outcome is going to look like. We got it already. So once we go against the grain, which requires this like tremendous upheaval of effort, right? First, intellectually, we have to understand, first of all, why we're doing it, or why we would want to do it, and what it would even take before we even start. Ultimately, the intellect is capable of doing this if it can consider its predicament. What happens after the intellect makes these choices or decisions is that we start feeling things, right? That intellectual understanding becomes the feeling tones, right, of our practice. We actually start to feel out that which was previously just an idea, right? And feeling tones, the word that's sometimes used for them is rasa, you know, the rasas, the tastes, the aromas of what arises from practice, they are very, very profound, and they go as deep as you want them to go. Like the more attention and effort and fire you put into them, the more the feeling tones grow, and the more they subsume you. Ultimately, they become so hot, meaning from the heat and pressure of life force and attention, that they start to mix and churn and boil in a way that produces, as a catalyst, various reactions, various transmutations. And this is the way that purification is forced to happen, by essentially turning up the heat in the churning, boiling cauldron of the heart of beingness. It happens through feeling tone. This is where the intellect takes you, and thinking and feeling, for the most part, are under our control. What happens after that point of thinking and feeling is entering into the parts of practice that we can't do. Sometimes they're allowed to happen by virtue of grace, and sometimes they're not. We could think and feel and make ourselves think and feel if we put all our effort into it. But past that point, we're a stranger in a strange land. We're the baby, totally ill-equipped to deal with the world of adults. And what happens is that thinking and feeling cook themselves away as subjectivity becomes so subtle that all that's left is the brightness of silence presenting itself as pure texture, like the effulgence texturizes itself. Like it's far from the realization of true openness and the true silence, because the mind is still there in subtle form, but it arises in a textured form. And the texture patterns itself. And at that point where feeling tone becomes pure texture, the knower has all but disappeared, but there is still the residue of knowingness associated with conventional habit patterns. And in this textured silence, that's where a lot of the understanding of scintillation comes from. The scintillating presentation of luminosity. This is where we start becoming aware of luminosity, or realizing luminosity. And the way that it scintillates through the habit field produces what is largely referred to as bliss states, which ultimately become states of bliss clarity, right? The further we go. And the further we go into these texturized states, the deeper we can realize what's called clear light, the clarity itself, luminous clarity itself. Most people take the realization of clear luminosity as awareness to be a realization of the divine, but it isn't. It's just another stage that we have to pass through, because ultimately even light falls through itself into luminal darkness, into nothingness, but a nothingness that is full, right? And this is where the type of mysticism that we're talking about, which is ultimately what all my work leads towards, is called the apophatic style of mysticism, right? And there are Western texts that talk about this quite explicitly. You can read about it in the work of Pseudo-Dionysius, right? And also there's a 14th century English text, which I know almost nothing about, but it speaks about this, called The Cloud of Unknowing.
I read that a few years ago, and yeah, beautiful.
The work of unknowing, the apophatic aspect, sometimes it's called negative theology, but that's a misnomer, the way that it's, what the implications are, essentially culminates as luminous awareness falls through itself, right? Where does it fall? Nowhere. What is falling? Nowhere. Right? Because by the time you get to that point, the stages that posit identity as thinking and feeling, they're like way long in the past. Right? So that all that I just described is the sacrifice of the serpent. all that I just described is the Nachash as sacrificial beast, the beast of the field. But the field we're talking about is the appearance field. And remember the gematria of the name Nachash in the Bible is 358. It's the gematria of Moshiach, Messiah.
Yep, of the Messiah. That's right. So, that's the most famous, numerical equivalent in gematria. Yep.
Yeah. Well, the deliverer, the redeemer, and the deceiver are the same in the sense that the mind is both its own poison and its own medicine.
Of course. And, being a Bodha student, of course, when I think of 358, automatically it becomes tarot cards, which I interpret backwards, which would be 8, strength, 5, the Hierophant, which is intuition, and 3, which is the Empress, which is creativity. So you have a Kundalini operating through the activity of the inner guidance or inner wisdom or inner intuition acting upon the ground of creativity. So in tarot things can sometimes make more sense to me, but again, that's just a tool, like you mentioned, and it's a conceptual one. Do you ever find it to be a little too overwhelming or disorienting coming out of some of these states of consciousness to reorient yourself back in the so-called real world?
Well, there's lots of ways I could answer that question. And like the first 5 that I think of are all too glib. So the best way I could explain that is like when you seek to devote everything to this, right, to become a retreatant like we spoke about, you're pretty much resigned to going with the overwhelming, hey, where did he go? Hey, he left. It's okay. You still there? I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I had to get up and take care of something. Please continue.
Oh, okay. Yeah. When it becomes the sum total and main event of everything else, and you lose all interest in other things, which is really what being a retreatant is. Like being a retreatant is somebody who's not interested in other things. They're just interested in this, right? So they just do this. So it's not some grand heroic gesture. It's that you're autistic at that point. That's really what it means. You're making yourself autistic. And when that happens to a person, you're pretty much resigned to trying to induce that overwhelming state all the time. And any less would be a falling away. So yeah, do I feel overwhelmed? Yeah. Does it hurt? Yeah. Am I successful? No. Most of the time, no. But I keep banging my head against the wall anyway, because I'm overwhelmed and because the alternatives are just so grim. Like, what else is there that one would want to do? What else are you going to do? What else is there that has any relevance at all? I mean, if you're starting from that standpoint where you don't even have to ask the question, what is this competing with? Right? Like a retreatant practitioner starts out from the standpoint of there is no competition, right? There's no other thing I'd rather be doing. I don't want to be on a beach in Jamaica instead, right? Is sipping a drink with a flower coming out of it. Like, that's not better. Or anything else, fill in the blank, right? So if it's this, and I am like stupidly focused on it, for better or for worse, I could be doing a terrible job, but still, this is the thing that I'm trying to do. I'd be a total idiot, but that's the thing I'm being an idiot about, right? It's just like anything else in life where you get what you get, and there'll be ups and downs. I think when you were asking about being overwhelmed, you were talking about to the point of disorientation, maybe?
Pretty much disorientation, or if it's a transition from one completely altered state of mind back to another, is there a dysphoria, perhaps a dysphoria or an inability to kind of get your bearings again, basically?
Oh, hell yeah. I mean, it becomes
Yeah.
mental illness. You have to essentially make yourself mentally ill, and pass through that and have a certain amount of ability to navigate and tolerate that without it swallowing you. But I'm not in it alone, and I have resources and tools. But yeah, there were periods of formal retreat that were pretty bad with that. And every single person I know who's done formal retreat of that type has had that. I don't know what you call it. It's just the price of admission.
Growth pains, at the very least, I'm sure.
Yeah, but I can't really say that I've been admitted. I'm still a knucklehead. So, like there are people who have stable realization. So when we talk about gnosis, there is the world of tastes of gnosis, and someone who's had a taste of gnosis has some realization. But then there are those who are stable in their realization, meaning they don't fall back into a habitual state. That stability is a totally different matter. I mean, once that stable state has been realized, that's what we call a master, somebody who does not fall back into habituation. And I do not have stable realization, which is, I mean, duh, obviously, just, read my books. You would probably know that, because I'm talking about the flux. I'm talking about the actual path. Part of the reason why my books are good for people is because it's good for them to read a book written by a practitioner, right? Because very often the work of a master would be unuseful and unintelligible because they're not talking about the path. They're not on the path. They've done the path, right? So reading the work of a practitioner who's talking about it creatively could be of enormous value, because I'm probably closer to where the reader of the book is, except I've had, a tremendous background that they might have never seen before, which is usually the case, that the readers of my books haven't seen what I'm offering. So for them, it's like, could be very important. And that's what I'm shooting for. But stability is a different story. And there's just in my opinion, a handful of beings around at any given time that are of that stature. Because when you're talking about stable realization, you're talking about the level of a Buddha or a Christ. To make such a claim for yourself. And there's people all over YouTube making this claim. You believe it?
The secret chiefs of Blavatsky, all that. Yeah.
Well, we used to refer to her as Madame Blah, blah, blah.
That's a good one.
Talk's a good game.
Yeah. No, as you say, though, the concept of some sort of stable or fixed realization that doesn't go away, that is totally alien to try to fathom, I think, for most people.
Well, that's generally referred to as the post-path state of realization. There is the path and there is post-path. Post-path means stability. And I think that's a very difficult thing to talk about.
Sure.
I mean, because I'm not talking from experience. So
of course.
Yeah.
This would be a speculative question, of course. Would you presume some sort of any attainment of a degree of success with stabilizing gnosis and enlightenment? Would you imagine that is something that would carry over lifetime after lifetime, or simply perhaps free one from the whole chain to go off somewhere we can't even imagine?
No, my understanding of it is it absolutely carries over lifetime to lifetime, but the realization itself doesn't carry over. The propensity for it carries over, which means that if an individual attains stable realization in one lifetime and it seems the body falls away, the momentum of that trajectory will assert itself again, but sufficient practice will have to be done. They won't be born enlightened. they will be born unenlightened. And then they will have to do an amount of practice to regain what they already are and have. However, their path trajectory will be far quicker than most beings. It will be like lightning fast and can be done in a matter of, just a few years or less.
Like learning to ride a bike again.
Yeah, because they are remembering something rather than figuring it out for the first time. Yeah, and there's tons of literature about this. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not saying it like pulling it out of nowhere. There's a lot of literature about this.
I think in the Tibetan system, it would be referred to as like the rainbow body or the body of light or something like that.
Well, this is behind the lore of the tulku, and there's a lot of crap about tulkus as well. For example, you go to any big corporate Tibetan lineage, right? You see these tulku kids who are just there for political reasons, and that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. That's all fake. But the concept behind it is real. Can you give me 1 minute, please?
Absolutely. In fact, do you mind if we take 5? I'm going to go get some more coffee.
I'll be right back.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Ask anything you want.
Anything we want. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you foresee? I'm going to get speculative. What do you foresee arising of benefit spiritually to humanity in the next decade? I personally see a K-shaped curved approaching, in the sense of maybe it's a reflection of the wealth gap. I guess the rich get richer and the small businesses have kind of taken a big hit in the last year of 2020 with COVID and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to metaphysical philosophy, spiritual practice, an opening up and sort of a co-mixture occurring in a lot of spiritual communities, I, for one, see, again, I'm an optimist, but I see a sort of explosion potentially occurring beneficially in interconnectivity through things like the internet that we're operating with now. I see a potential new renaissance occurring in spiritual practices that perhaps are bringing more of this vitalism into their systems that you're talking about, not necessarily just by cross-pollinizing with different systems, or perhaps systems that began with a similar root, went off into all these different branches that never communicate with each other, and some of those reconnecting, but as well a sense of a deeper search for people on behalf of the average spiritual aspirant, looking deeper into whatever system they're working in to try to bring back that vitalism. Do you share my optimism in that?
Well, what you're describing is kind of something that waxes and wanes throughout human history. We like what I said about the 13th century. Before, you had this great overlap between traditions that were at like their peak intensity in the Jewish world, in the Muslim world, in the Christian world, in the Buddhist world, in the Hindu world, right? Like all those lineages were in certain geographic areas talking to each other, and that was like maximum interpenetration that you could say at a certain point in the 13th century was definitely happening. But does that mean that the world was perfect? No. Does it mean that a greater percentage of beings were benefiting? No, I don't believe that it did. I think that you could show wonderful connections and missing pieces in systems to humanity, and the same amount of benefit will be derived as when it was hidden. It's always a minority, even in the greatest periods of renaissances that you're talking about. It was still just this tiny fraction of people that were actually waking up. More people were hearing about it, maybe. But I think that the minority of real practitioners who had the wherewithal to see through the systems that they were hearing about is so rare that the same number of people ends up doing it even during the worst historical periods, right? In the waxing and waning, I think it remains equal. So no, I don't think anything is really going to change. I think human beings will still mix the nectar of pure realized luminous openness with the mundane imputation of conceptual designations and the mud of psychological identification and projection. And that mixture of nectar and mud, which becomes the appearance field for a being, will remain largely the same no matter what external circumstance happens or doesn't happen. I think it's always more or less the same.
Love it. And perhaps that is a consistent ratio in the collective of for every Sir Francis Bacon, and for every Da Vinci. There's always going to be all the commoners that never question anything and just go along with whatever it is they're
Yeah,
told.
I mean, it's not like I'm against renaissances. Obviously they're great and they provide a renewed flavor to wake up dying systems. However, who makes use of those systems? And more importantly, what does it take to make use of them? It takes such a tremendous wherewithal to persevere and follow through once you've made contact with such a system, to become a practitioner, and it takes tremendous wherewithal to find it. And then it takes tremendous wherewithal to join with it. And then it takes tremendous wherewithal to do something with what you've joined. I mean, there are people in these lineages who go nowhere after 20 years. And even amongst the people who do get somewhere, the growth is partial. So the minority of people who make profound leaps, it's like infinitesimal number.
Fractions and fractions of percentages for even those who are interested, and those who are interested are infinitesimal.
Yeah, but here's the good news. That was bad news. That was the pessimistic part. The optimistic part is that even just one individual who has some spark of realization, even if it's not stable, can affect the entirety of the appearance field. Right? So there are always, in this realm of the human realm, some awakened individuals with some realization affecting the quality of the realm. There always have been and there always will be. You could make a pretty good case for saying if it was ever otherwise, the whole system would collapse and there would be no reality and no beings, no human beings. I'm not coming from a position where I believe that the objectivity of reality is a given. The reason why there seem to be universes the way that there seem to be is because we are perceiving them. They're not like that. Our perceptions are like that. So we're always only talking about the perceived portion of what's going on. We're not actually talking about what's going on. We're talking about what is perceived that seems to be going on. There's no other way around it. There's no other way to do it. Right.
And if I may ask, is it true that you have a set date on when your work will end?
Yeah. How did you know? Did I tell you that?
You did.
Yeah. My work ends in 2033. Right. And I'm not sure how many volumes of my current series I'll be putting out. But yes, I'm going to stop working in 2033 at, I think it's at age 69. But yes, I'm going to live, hopefully, probably, long enough to complete my work in 2033. And I'm tailoring it so that it has a culmination. I'm tailoring it so that it just doesn't stop. So it has, it's a life, for better or for worse.
And with your latest two works, like I mentioned, it's tangible. Your living engagement with all of the topic matter that you write about and the images you produce. It was tangible with your latest two works that you feel. It feels as though you're approaching a bit of a central point. A central point in the buildup of your mission and of your explorations and of your unfoldment. The unfoldment itself is kind of tangible and revealing itself along the way.
Well, it's sort of like Gurdjieff's theory of the octaves, where you go through the series of steps within one octave and then the octave changes and then you go through the same derivation of steps in another octave, right? And yeah, my work is kind of like that, especially if you look at where it started in around 2007, and you look at how it's progressed. But then again, if you want to understand what I did in 2007, you have to look at the 16 years of training and preparation that it took me to even make that first thing. So there was 16 years of just training and figuring out what was going on first. I mean, and that's, if you want to know the history of the work, that's pretty much it. But what's going to happen in 2033 is anybody's guess. I don't know. I mean, I'll just do the best I can until that point. But yeah, 2033, I'm going to stop. And we'll see what's going to happen after that. It's an interesting question. I don't know.
There's a lot of people with a lot of theories out there, and yeah,
about
we'll see.
what?
Well, the technological singularity, perhaps open contact with extraterrestrials, perhaps. Oh goodness, some sort of mass extinction. The theories just run the gamut out there, and any people who are pushing them or ascribe to them seem fully convinced. I don't think anyone really knows, and I think it's meant to be that way. And it's all still happening as we speak. Thankfully, there's some participation involved.
I would put money on nothing really changing that much.
Yeah,
that's my guess.
If you're wrong, it's a happy surprise.
If you want my gambler's bet, I would place my money on the chip that says no contact with extraterrestrials and no mass extinction.
Yeah, I'm leaning that way myself too.
Yeah. I'm putting my money on some version of the same old crap. Yeah, on the mundane level. But then again, I don't care because I have no skin in the game. I'm not part of this culture. Really don't care that much about it or follow it. Yeah. I mock it when I'm in the mood, but it doesn't affect me all that much. I don't care who's president.
Yeah.
Not really.
It's an enlightened approach.
Well, no, I just don't care.
Well, it's all going to carry on regardless of our opinions anyways. So
yeah, boy, that's going to make some people mad.
Champion a cause, damn it. Come on, David.
Yeah. The cause is the annihilation of delusion. So I'm starting with my own and I'm trying to, kill the beast. It's got a few forks and, plastic forks stuck in it and is running around screaming.
You're taking one for the team and we're eagerly watching along the way and learning.
Well,
from you.
The beast is.
Yeah.
So I'll answer anything else you want with the remaining time that we have. And then I will be eating some soft shell crabs.
Yes, it is approaching dinner time. And thank you again so much for how much time you spent with us today. It's a gem.
Sure.
Let's see. Final question. What would Eric Simpkins ask David Chaim Smith? Do you feel that your early interest in art, because I know you were an artist before you were an occultist, do you feel that was preordained for your mission, or do you think it was happenstance?
Do I feel that being an artist was, well, I would have no way of knowing. And besides, what would the difference be? Because if you believe in predestination, destined by who and for what and in what context. So I'm not really sure what predestination is, because who would have the will to have predestined and realized that destination? I mean, most of the time, predestination is spoken about on behalf of a creator deity, which I do not hold that view. I don't hold a theistic view that there is either a creator deity or a first cause of any kind. So to me, it's all spontaneous display. And are there patterns within spontaneous display? Absolutely. But that's a larger question. So let's ask more specifically, if you want to know something about my early life as an artist in the 1980s, What do you want to know about it?
Oh, goodness.
I mean, it wasn't very interesting.
I suppose I didn't have too many questions about your early life. I find a sort of a providence, I guess you could say, revealing itself in certain people's lives. And perhaps ascribing that to any kind of destiny or anything that was preordained might be a fallacious way of looking at it, because any sense of providence is usually after the fact, I suppose, looking back at all the dots connecting to build up to something that became beautiful.
Well, I mean, it certainly worked out well that one day I was in my apartment with my teacher, and he told me that I had to start writing books and making images that made the actual connection between what I was learning from him and the systems that I came from, the Western occult systems. And it just so happened that I had a extensive background of making images with tools to be able to do that. So that was lucky. It also seemed to be fortuitous and lucky that I ended up marrying a woman who could put together, lay out, and produce books that were beautiful and on a very high level of organization, and run the business of selling and distributing them. That was pretty fortuitous and lucky. I certainly couldn't do it myself. I can't organize anything. And a series of other things that just fell together to, yes, a very big blessing to be able to do those things and have those tools. I knew when I was an artist in the 80s that I wasn't particularly interested in art, because I don't think what I'm doing is art in the contemporary conventional context. And I used to think that that somehow fitted in to the art world. And I had shows and galleries, gallery representation and all that. And it never really worked out right, because the people that came in to the galleries to look at the work were not really interested in what I was actually trying to say at all. So I knew something was wrong here. It's not right for this. And then I looked around and saw what it was actually about in the art world, which was largely a sort of solipsistic, masturbatory, academic backwash of political and social ideas. Certainly since mid 20th century, it's been that. Yeah. So, I never really made much headway into that world. And I wasn't alive during a time when there were great geniuses in visual art that I could look to and admire. It was pretty much a wasteland. So as it is today, even far worse than the 80s. I mean, I'm not interested in the art of this culture one iota. So I couldn't tell you anything about it, except I try to avoid it, which is not the same as other art forms, because there are some composers, writing music that I greatly admire. That's a different story. I'm talking specifically just about visual art, and specifically visual art in Europe and America, which is what I actually know and was part of and did all that. Plus, I had all the baggage of my own problems when I was doing that, which was real, addiction issues, which I went through. And I got clean in 1990. So, that's a lot of years.
Yeah. Yeah. And your role as an esoteric cartographer with the images you produce, working with your rather unique and, for the most part, unknown system of oral tradition that you're working with, I guess the role that you're playing almost reminds me a little bit of like a William Walker Atkinson type character, where there was that unique role where I think he was a lawyer and he was a grocer on a grocery store. And yet about 100 years ago, here he is, a little more than 100 years ago now, here he is writing all of these mystical texts under all these pseudonyms, where he was acting as sort of a front for secret, societies. publishing works that they wanted to remain anonymous on. They didn't want to reveal their, secret societies, you know, secret knowledge and blah blah blah. So he was doing it for them. This is sort of like public mouthpiece or public front for occult wisdom. And in that regard, you've turned your own private practice into a similar sort of public service for your very secretive oral tradition, in the sense that your teacher is not writing books. Your teacher is not doing this cartography.
Actually, my teacher's written some books.
Oh, really? I did not know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, my teacher just finished like 3 books.
Interesting.
But they have nothing to do with the systems that I write about. Like my teacher is not writing about anything that a Western esotericist would know and deal with. My teacher writes for the system of that he deals with. He doesn't know any Qaballah or alchemy in the sense that, I'm talking to a different symbol system, a different language than he is.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah.
I mean, his books wouldn't work in my audience, and my books wouldn't work in. I don't know what his audience is, actually, so I couldn't say that mine wouldn't work in his. I don't know what his is, but I would imagine that they would have something to do with Vajrayana. Yeah. Like with Vajrayana, I have a background in it, but I don't talk about it in my books. And it's not like I'm marrying the Kabbalistic and alchemical systems that I use to Vajrayana. I don't mention Vajrayana at all. I take the dynamics and the ethos of the practice of those systems and how they work, and I use that as a model for the reshaping and the remaking of the pieces of systems that are largely perceived by me as being incomplete, and the dots being needed to be filled in. So in a sense, I take working parts of a system which is on various levels of brokenness and put it back together again in the form that I know to be coherent.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, that's the attempt.
Well, on that note, David, what do you say we go get some dinner?
Okay, thank you for interviewing me. I had a lot of fun. I don't know if you're going to break this up into parts or how you're going to do it, but just send me a link when you do, and I'd love to see who it appeals to.
Will do, and thank you so much for your time. Love your work. We will be watching, and thank you for
Eric.
being you, so that the rest of us don't have to.
Thank you, Eric. You wouldn't want to be. Thank you so much. And I'll speak to you at some future point.
Okay, sounds good. Take care, brother.
Okay.